In a recent and highly contentious session of the United Nations Security Council, Russia's acting envoy Dmitry Polyansky launched an explosive attack on Ukraine and its Western allies, claiming that the deaths of civilians in Kyiv and other regions were caused not by Russian military operations but by what he described as deliberate and cynical actions of President Volodymyr Zelensky and his administration, sparking outrage, heated exchanges, and deep divisions among member states, with Moscow doubling down on its narrative that Kyiv's government has been consistently using civilians as human shields, operating torture prisons, and laundering billions of dollars through offshore shell companies, a charge that reverberated far beyond the chambers of the UN and into the broader geopolitical discourse surrounding the war that has ravaged Ukraine since February 2022, when Russia launched what it calls a special military operation, and Ukraine and its allies describe as an unprovoked invasion. Polyansky's statement, covered widely by international media, particularly shocked observers because of its brazen attempt to turn the blame for civilian casualties away from Russia. Despite overwhelming documentation from the United Nations, human rights groups, and investigative journalists showing that Russian missile strikes, artillery bombardments, and drone attacks have devastated residential neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, and energy infrastructure throughout Ukraine, and instead lay it squarely at the feet of Kyiv's leadership, a rhetorical maneuver consistent with Moscow's broader strategy of information warfare, disinformation, and counter-narratives intended to weaken Western solidarity with Ukraine, undermine Zelensky's credibility, and reframe Russia's actions as defensive rather than aggressive. The Russian envoy argued that Ukraine, in coordination with Western allies, staged certain incidents, manipulated media coverage, and intentionally deployed military assets in civilian-populated areas, thereby ensuring that when Russian forces struck these targets, civilian casualties would follow, a claim that Kyiv and its supporters vehemently deny, insisting instead that Ukraine has gone to extraordinary lengths to evacuate civilians, construct bomb shelters, and safeguard its population while under relentless Russian attack. Yet Russia persists in this line of argument because it helps justify its ongoing war effort domestically and internationally, presenting itself as a victim of Western manipulation rather than the aggressor in a brutal conflict. The allegations extended further when Polyansky accused Zelensky's government of running torture prisons against political opponents and ordinary citizens, painting a grim picture of human rights abuses that, if true, would significantly undermine Ukraine's image as a democracy resisting authoritarian aggression. Though no independent evidence has verified such sweeping claims, and many analysts interpret these accusations as part of Russia's long-standing tactic of accusing its enemies of the very crimes it itself is accused of committing, given that multiple human rights reports have documented torture, forced deportations, and arbitrary detentions carried out by Russian forces in occupied Ukrainian territories. Additionally, Polyansky raised allegations of financial corruption, asserting that Ukraine's leadership laundered more than $1.2 billion through offshore shell companies, echoing long-standing narratives about corruption in Ukraine, which historically has struggled with governance and transparency issues. But critics noted that raising these allegations at such a critical moment served primarily to weaken Western resolve to keep funding Kyiv's defense, as fatigue with financial aid is already growing in certain parts of Europe and the United States, where lawmakers are questioning how much longer and how much more money should be poured into supporting Ukraine's war effort. The speech, peppered with sarcasm and derision, mocked Western leaders for what Russia sees as blind loyalty to Zelensky, portraying him as a manipulative figure willing to sacrifice his own people to maintain Western sympathy and financial flows, while in Moscow's framing, Russia is portrayed as a responsible actor seeking to liberate Ukraine from neo-Nazi elements and NATO encroachment, a narrative rejected by most of the international community but still influential in certain regions of the global south where skepticism of Western power runs deep. The heated atmosphere of the UNSC meeting reflected not only the war in Ukraine itself but also the wider geopolitical struggle, as Western representatives condemned Russia's aggression, restated their support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and dismissed Moscow's claims as cynical propaganda, while countries more sympathetic or neutral toward Russia, such as China and some developing nations, refrained from outright condemnation and instead called for negotiations and de-escalation, illustrating how the war has split global opinion and created fault lines that extend far beyond Europe. Polyansky's intervention thus highlighted the information war that runs parallel to the battlefield, where narratives, accusations, and counter-accusations are as important as tanks and missiles, because public opinion, international solidarity, and diplomatic legitimacy are key battlegrounds in their own right, shaping not only military aid packages but also the long-term settlement of the war. Russia's insistence on blaming Zelensky for civilian deaths in Kyiv as part of its broader effort to delegitimize Ukraine's leadership, sow distrust between Kyiv and its Western backers, and convince a wider international audience that the real villain is not Moscow but Washington, Brussels, and their puppet in Kyiv, a strategy that has had mixed results, as while it resonates within Russia due to heavy state control of media, it has largely failed to convince Western publics who have access to independent reporting, satellite imagery, and eyewitness testimony documenting Russia's widespread destruction of civilian areas. Nevertheless, by raising these issues in the high-profile forum of the United Nations, Russia ensures that its narrative is recorded in official transcripts, amplified through state media, and fed into alternative media ecosystems worldwide, where conspiracy theories and contrarian narratives often find fertile ground, allowing Moscow to keep alive a parallel version of reality where it is not the aggressor but the defender of truth and justice. For Ukraine, the challenge remains not only to defend its territory militarily but also to defend its reputation politically, countering Russian disinformation at every turn, highlighting Russia's war crimes, and persuading the international community that continued support is both morally necessary and strategically wise in order to preserve the rules-based international order that prohibits aggressive wars of conquest, which Russia's invasion so blatantly violates. Yet the longer the war drags on, the more such Russian interventions at the UN are likely to test Western resolve, feeding narratives of fatigue, corruption, and endless conflict that may erode unity, making it all the more crucial for Ukraine to maintain credibility, transparency, and effectiveness both on the battlefield and in governance, lest Russia's propaganda gain traction where it matters most, in the halls of power in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and beyond. Where decisions about aid, weapons, and sanctions are made, decisions that will ultimately shape not only the fate of Kyiv's civilians but the trajectory of the entire war and the future of international norms in the face of aggression.